My name is Natalie Williams. I was 28 and had been gone from home for 5 long years, carving out a life in places my parents never cared to visit, wearing a uniform they'd never wanted to see. Still, when my mother's text arrived, just a single, cheery sentence, "Family dinner this Sunday, everyone's coming." I packed a bag and made the drive back to our little Montana. The air was sharp with the first hints of winter, and every familiar streetlight flickered with old memories, both sweet and bitter. As I pulled into the driveway, I could see the silhouettes of my father, mother, and brother through the kitchen window, laughing, already a world apart. That night I would take my seat at the family table, just another plate among many, pretending not to notice the side glances, the soft sighs, the jokes about my adventures, but none of them knew that a single moment was coming. A moment that would force them to see me for who I really am. If you've ever sat quietly at a table where no one sees you, this story is for you. I hadn't crossed the threshold of my parents' home in so many years, yet everything about the place was unchanged. The porch creaked the same way it had when I used to sneak out as a teenager. My mother's wind chimes, faded and cracked, still caught the faintest breeze, tinkling nervously like they too were waiting to see how the night would unfold. I paused for a moment at the door, letting my breath settle and my heart slow. Then I opened it, stepping back into the house that had never quite felt like home. Warmth and light spilled from the kitchen. My mother, Karen Williams, stood by the stove, fussing over a casserole. She was all sharp elbows and nervous energy, her blonde hair pulled tightly back as if even a stray strand would spell chaos. She glanced up as I entered, offering a practiced smile that flickered for just a second before her gaze drifted past me, searching for someone else. "Natalie, you made it. Take your coat off. Dinner's almost ready." My father, Richard, was setting the table with the careful precision he brought to every part of his life. He nodded at me, his jaw set, as if he was bracing himself for turbulence he couldn't control. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, and it sounded so automatic I wondered if he'd practiced it in his head first. At that moment, my older brother Daniel strolled in through the back door. He brought with him a gust of cold air and the effortless confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt his place at the table. "There she is," Daniel boomed, his grin wide. "Back from saving the world?" He winked at my father as if the joke were just for the two of them. The living room was filled with artifacts of the Williams family myth. Daniel's trophies from Little League and high school debate, framed diplomas, a shadow box with his first business card. My childhood was there too, but only the parts that fit the story everyone wanted to tell. Faded photo of me in a cheerleader's uniform, a medal from a spelling bee I'd won in 3rd grade, my acceptance letter to the state university before I threw the family off course by applying for an ROTC scholarship and choosing the Army over a career in finance or law. The rest of my story, the chapters that made up most of my life, were missing. No photos from my commissioning ceremony, no newspaper clippings from overseas deployments, not even a souvenir from the time I'd met the president as part of a security briefing. My achievements were invisible here, edited out like a typo in the family scrapbook. I moved quietly through the familiar rooms, feeling like a guest. My mother flitted around me, setting out dishes and utensils, never quite meeting my eyes for more than a moment. "You must be starving, Natalie," she said, her voice high and bright. "I made your favorite chicken pot pie, just like when you were little." She slid the dish into the center of the table, but her attention was already back on Daniel, who was regaling my father with stories about a recent deal at his tech startup, his new car, his upcoming wedding to a woman my parents adored. Every word he spoke was another brick in the wall between us, a wall that had been built up over years of silent comparison. We sat down, the 4 of us, in the same places we'd always sat. Daniel on my father's right, my mother at the head of the table, me at the end, a little closer to the kitchen than anyone else. The dinner began with the usual pleasantries. My mother asked about my drive. My father inquired about the weather in wherever you're living these days. Daniel made jokes about army rations and how I must miss real food. There was laughter, but it was a laughter that had nothing to do with me. I listened to their voices as if from underwater, every syllable reminding me that I was a visitor in my own family. As the meal continued, the conversation turned, as it always did, toward Daniel's latest accomplishments. "Did you hear? my mother said, her eyes shining. Daniel's company just closed another round of funding. He's the youngest VP they've ever had. My father beamed, raising his glass. That's my boy, real leadership material. Daniel leaned back, modest but clearly relishing the praise. I had a great mentor, Dad. My mother laughed, delighted. We always knew Daniel would do great things, she said, as if I weren't sitting right there. Did you know he's looking at buying a house out in Willow Creek? 4 bedrooms, huge yard, just perfect for a family. My father nodded approvingly, already envisioning the grandchildren who would one day fill the place. A real Williams legacy, he declared. I tried to join in, to ask Daniel about his fiancée or his plans, but my words fell flat. No one asked about my work, my friends, or my life. The one time my mother turned to me, it was with a question so pointed it felt like a blade. So, Natalie, are you still traveling around with the army? When are you going to settle down and get a real job? She said it kindly, with that tilt of her head that implied concern, but I heard the judgment beneath it. It's a career, Mom, I replied, and I'm actually stationed here for a few weeks. There's a conference in town. She nodded, filing the information away, not because she was interested, but because it might come in handy at some future dinner party where she'd need to explain my absence. The rest of the evening passed in a series of small humiliations. My father asked Daniel for advice about his 401, ignoring the fact that I'd managed million-dollar budgets. My mother showed off photos of Daniel's fiancée on her phone, while the only picture she had of me was from a Christmas years ago. Even the dog, an old golden retriever named Max, seemed to prefer Daniel's side of the table. At one point, Daniel raised his glass and toasted, "To family and future successes," and everyone clinked glasses except me. I'd already lowered mine, afraid my hand might tremble. As the plates were cleared and coffee was poured, the air in the room grew heavier. The conversation drifted to old stories. Daniel's triumphs at school, my parents' own rise from modest beginnings, the sacrifices they'd made to give us a better life. In each story, Daniel played the hero. I was the punchline, the free spirit, the one who couldn't quite find her way. Remember when Natalie wanted to be an astronaut? My father laughed. She hated math, my mother joined in, but she did make a mean apple pie. They meant no harm, or so I told myself, but I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller with every word. The worst part was not their words, but their certainty. My family didn't see themselves as cruel. To them, this was all good-natured ribbing, the gentle teasing that passed for love in our house. They didn't know what it was like to sit at that table and feel like the ghost of a daughter they'd never quite gotten. They didn't realize how every small slight cut deeper because it was so casual, so effortless. After dinner, my mother brought out dessert, apple pie, of course, and Daniel's fiancée called on FaceTime. The whole family crowded around the phone, laughing and chatting, while I sat off to the side, sipping my coffee and watching the scene unfold as if it were a play I'd forgotten the lines to. No one noticed when I slipped out onto the back porch. The air was cold, biting, but it felt better than the warmth inside. I looked up at the night sky, searching for constellations I used to trace as a kid, wishing for a sign that I still belonged somewhere. Eventually, my father came out to find me. He stood beside me, silent for a long moment. "It's good to have you home, Natalie," he said at last. "Your mother worries about you, you know." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Daniel's doing well," he continued, as if I'd asked. "We're proud of him. Always knew he'd be something special." I bit my tongue. "I know," I said. He patted my shoulder awkwardly, then turned back inside. I stayed outside a while longer, breathing in the darkness, willing myself not to cry. When I finally returned, the kitchen was empty, the remains of dinner cleared away. My mother had left a plate of pie on the counter with a note. "Glad you're here. Love, Mom." I took the plate to my old bedroom, the same faded quilt, the same posters on the wall, the same sense of never quite fitting in. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sounds of my family downstairs, I wondered how long it would take before I stopped trying to prove myself to people who couldn't or wouldn't see me. And yet, a flicker of hope remained. Tomorrow would be a new day. I had come home, and for better or worse, I was still here. I had no idea that the world I thought I knew was about to turn upside down, and that the very thing my family had always dismissed would soon become the only thing that mattered. Sleep in my childhood room was a fragile thing, fractured by the muffled sounds of laughter downstairs and the occasional pang of memories I couldn't quite bury. The old quilt itched, the mattress sagged in the middle, but mostly it was the ache in my chest that kept me awake. My mind wandered through all the other times I'd returned home, hoping things might be different. It just faded at the edges. The next morning, sunlight filtered through yellowed curtains and painted stripes across the floor. I sat up, noticing the box of keepsakes in the corner. Inside were a few medals from high school, some letters from friends who'd drifted away, a dried corsage from prom. All relics from before I'd left to chase something nobody else seemed to understand. Upstairs, my mother was already bustling, humming a tune as she whisked eggs for breakfast. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep all right?" she asked, setting a mug of coffee on the counter. I nodded, taking a sip, the warmth filling a place inside me that words never seemed to reach. My father was hidden behind the newspaper, grunting a greeting as I evenings. Daniel walked in, hair still perfect, freshly showered, already dressed for success. "Big day today," he announced, sliding into a chair. "Got to take a few calls before the meeting, but I can't wait to show you all the new plans for the office." My mother beamed. "You work so hard, Daniel. You really make us proud." I tried to join the conversation, asking about the company's latest project, but was met with a polite, brief summary before the topic veered back to Daniel's achievements. Mom fussed over his shirt, telling him he looked just like his father at that age. Dad nodded, pride flickering in his eyes, and said, "You know, Daniel, your uncle called yesterday asking about that deal you closed. Word's getting around." Daniel accepted the praise with practiced humility, never glancing my way. After breakfast, my mother began clearing dishes and casually turned the conversation to my life. "So, Natalie, is the army still sending you everywhere?" Her tone was gentle, but beneath it was a wariness, a hope that I'd soon come to my senses. "Yes," I replied, "but I'm actually here on official business for a few days. There's a joint project with Pinnacle Defense. I'll be working from town." The words seemed to hang in the air, but she just smiled, her mind already elsewhere. "You should talk to Daniel about real estate while you're here. He's about to close on that house in Willow Creek. Isn't that right, honey?" Daniel nodded, launching into a story about the 3-car garage, the perfect yard, how he'd already picked out a spot for a grill. My father leaned forward, attentive, asking questions about square footage and investment potential. Not a single question came my way about what kind of work I actually did or how it mattered. I watched them all, feeling like a guest at someone else's celebration. I remembered the first time I'd come home after basic training, uniform pressed, chest puffed out with pride. I'd expected at least a hint of excitement, maybe a "welcome home, soldier," but all I'd gotten was a brief mention at dinner, a passing comment about how the army wasn't forever, and I'd settle down eventually. The memory stung now more than ever. That day, Daniel's fiancée Ashley joined us for lunch via video call. My mother set her phone in the center of the table so everyone could crowd around, cooing over wedding details and honeymoon plans. "Natalie, we have to get you a +1 for the wedding," Ashley said with a smile. "Maybe you'll meet someone at the reception." Everyone laughed except me. "Don't worry, Ash," my mother patted my hand. "It's not too late, you know. Your father and I didn't meet until our late 20s. The implication was clear. My clock was ticking, and I was the only one who didn't hear it. Later, as I wandered through the living room, my eyes caught on the family photo wall. Daniel's milestones were everywhere: diplomas, soccer trophies, a plaque from his first promotion. My own graduation photo was tucked in the corner, half hidden behind a potted plant. The photos that really mattered to me, the ones from my deployments, the medal ceremony, and I remembered emailing those pictures home, hoping for pride or even simple acknowledgement. Instead, my mother's response had been a short, "Looks nice, honey. Be safe." That night at dinner, the tension peaked. My mother had made steak, Daniel's favorite. Conversations sparkled around his work, Ashley's new job, the couple's plans for the holidays. My father leaned back, glass of red wine in hand, and said, "Daniel, you're going places. We're lucky to have a son like you." He didn't look at me. Daniel smiled and raised his glass in a toast. "To family, and to all our hard work paying off." I clinked my glass out of obligation. A few minutes later, my mother turned to me, voice light but sharp. "So, Natalie, do you think you'll ever put down roots? Maybe stay in one place, settle into something stable? There's nothing wrong with changing your mind, you know." I swallowed. "I like my job, Mom. I'm making a difference. We just finished a project that's going to help protect hundreds of people." My father barely glanced up. "That's nice, honey. Still, Daniel's work is really taking off. You could always think about getting your MBA. Never too late to pivot, right?" Daniel grinned. "You could come work at Pinnacle. Maybe there's an opening in HR." My mother's laughter tinkled, not unkind but unthinking, the sound of 100 small cuts adding up over the years. After dinner, as my parents and Daniel cleared the table, I stayed behind, staring at the pattern in the wood. I remembered other dinners, other slights, graduating with honors, only to be told, "It's not like you're a doctor or a lawyer." Getting my first commendation in the field, only to hear, "That's good, but are you safe? Maybe you should do something easier." The time I'd called home after a tough mission, hoping for comfort, and all my mother could say was, "Have you thought about teaching instead?" I felt the old familiar ache swell in my chest, a mixture of grief, anger, and exhaustion. I thought of the moments they'd missed, the achievements uncelebrated, the pride I'd learned to hold in silence. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they cared in a way that left no room for me to be anything other than what they'd always wanted. Just as I was about to head upstairs, Daniel stopped me in the hall. "Hey, Nat," he said, lowering his voice. "Don't let them get to you, okay? Mom and Dad they worry. They don't mean anything by it." I managed a tired smile. "I know, but sometimes it feels like I'm invisible." He shrugged, helpless. "You're not invisible, just different." I nodded, wishing I could believe him. That night, I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the house around me. I scrolled through my phone, reading old messages, searching for some evidence that I was more than just the family afterthought. The words from earlier echoed in my mind, "Em la gue dina tronc na fieng tu hau car." The sentence had fallen so casually from my mother's lips, but it had landed with the weight of a lifetime. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval. But the ache didn't fade. Somewhere, deep down, I still wanted them to see me. I still wanted to come home and belong. But as I drifted toward sleep, I knew tomorrow would demand more of me than they could ever understand. And I promised myself that if they weren't going to see what I'd accomplished, the world would soon make it impossible for them to. The next morning dawned with a sharp blue coldness outside my window, sunlight glinting off froth-streaked grass. I woke early, running through a ritual so ingrained it felt like muscle memory, stretching out the wrinkles in my uniform, checking every pin and insignia for perfect alignment, lacing up my boots just so. In that quiet moment, I felt a flicker of the pride I'd tried so many times to share with my family, an identity so clear, so hard-earned, and yet so misunderstood in this house. I glanced in the mirror, searching for traces of the uncertain daughter my parents saw, but instead found the calm, steady gaze of a soldier who'd led teams, made decisions in crises, and stood her ground when it mattered most. I pinned on my silver eagle, took a slow breath, and prepared myself to step into a world that finally recognized what my family never had. Downstairs, the house was quiet. My father was already gone, no doubt hurrying to his early meeting at Pinnacle Defense Systems. My mother's voice drifted from the living room as she talked on the phone with an aunt, discussing Daniel's house search and speculating about which neighborhood Ashley might prefer. She saw me standing in the doorway, eyes flicking over my pressed uniform before returning to her conversation. "All right, I have to go. Natalie's off to save the world again," she said lightly, offering me a quick, distracted smile as she hung up. I simply nodded and headed for the door. Died on the side, my breath fogged in the crisp air as I crossed the driveway. I got into my rental car and sat for a moment, the engine idling, gathering the courage that had gotten me through years of deployment but was somehow harder to summon in my hometown. I drove across town, passing familiar storefronts and the old playground where Daniel and I used to race bikes, now faded and half forgotten. The Pinnacle campus rose on the edge of the industrial park, all steel and glass and buzzing with purpose. I parked in the visitor's lot, collected my documents, and approached the security desk, flashing my military ID. The guard's eyes widened when he saw my rank. "Good morning, Colonel Williams. We've been expecting you." He stood a little straighter, handing me a visitor's badge even though my clearance was far higher than anyone else in the building. "Your escort will be right down." A few minutes later, a young assistant, nervous, clutching a clipboard, led me through a maze of hallways lined with framed patents and group photos. "The conference room is just ahead, ma'am. The executive team is assembling now." I thanked him, my voice even and formal, slipping easily into the part of myself I'd honed over years of service. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Engineers and project leads murmured among themselves, stealing glances at me as I took my seat near the head of the table. My father was there, pacing by the whiteboard, clearly anxious about the upcoming presentation. He glanced up and froze when he saw me, his eyes flickering with confusion, then embarrassment, as he processed the uniform, the rank, and the unexpected presence of his daughter in a space he'd considered his domain. "Natalie?" he said quietly, barely believing it. Before I could answer, the CO swept in, a striking woman in her 50s, all sharp edges and controlled authority. She strode across the room, her handshake firm and her greeting warm. "Colonel Williams, thank you for joining us in person. We're honored to have your expertise on this project." Her words rang out, carrying to the farthest corners of the room. My father stared, trying to reconcile the daughter he'd dismissed with the figure now being greeted as an equal by his own boss. The other executives introduced themselves with varying degrees of awe. I recognized a few names from email threads, but most of these men and women had never imagined the Army liaison was someone so young, let alone the person their colleague had called the black sheep. As people settled, I opened my folder and quietly reviewed the project files, line items, security protocols, testing results, waiting for the meeting to begin. Soon the room was full, department heads, engineers, and even Daniel, who'd arrived late, cheeks flushed and tie slightly askew. He did a double take when he saw me, confusion flickering across his features. "Nat, what are you doing here? And why are you—" His words faltered as he took in the silver eagle on my collar, and for once he was speechless. The CEO called the meeting to order. "Let's get started. As you all know, today's review is a critical milestone for our joint initiative with the Department of Defense. Colonel Williams, representing the Army's interests, will be evaluating our progress and making recommendations before we move to the next phase. Colonel, we look forward to your feedback." She turned to me with respect, and the rest of the room followed suit, stood, clearing my throat, and began outlining my analysis. What had been done well, what needed improvement, the standards the Army expected, and why security was non-negotiable. I spoke plainly, with the same directness I used in the field, feeling the room's attention sharpen as I outlined issues they hadn't anticipated. For every concern I raised, I offered solutions, walking them through the implications, citing my experience from other high-profile projects. My voice was steady, confident, every word a reminder that I'd earned my seat at this table. As I finished, the CEO nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Colonel. That was remarkably thorough. Does anyone have questions?" Hands shot up. Not to challenge me, but to ask for clarification, insight, guidance. For the next hour, I fielded technical questions from the engineering team, navigated the politics of budget constraints, and explained the Army's priorities to the board. Each time I spoke, I saw my father watching me, his face a shifting portrait of disbelief and dawning respect. Daniel, for once, stayed silent, listening, understanding the weight of the room in a way he never had before. It wasn't until the CEO addressed me directly, "Ma'am, would you be willing to review our latest proposal after the break?" that the magnitude of the moment landed. The word "ma'am" hung in the air, formal and public and unmistakable. My father's boss, the highest authority in his world, had just called me ma'am. The entire room turned, watching my father's reaction. He looked down at his hands, struggling to process the shift in power. The realization that the person he'd dismissed as going nowhere was now the one whose approval his entire team required. The meeting continued, but the mood was transformed. The engineers clustered around me during the break, eager to hear my opinion, grateful for my insight. The CEO stopped by again, thanking me for my candor and asking if I'd consider speaking at a future conference. Even Daniel, normally the center of every family gathering, looked at me with new eyes, curious, perhaps even proud. When the meeting ended, the CEO shook my hand in front of everyone. "Colonel Williams, your leadership is exactly what this project needs." She turned to my father. "Albert, you must be so proud." My father tried to speak, but for the first time, words failed him. I met his eyes, searching for some sign of acknowledgement, but saw only the bewilderment of a man forced to reevaluate everything he thought he knew, not just about his daughter, but about himself. As I gathered my things, a strange mix of relief and sadness swept through me. I had fought for this respect, earned it, and now, for the first time, there was no denying who I was. Walking out of that conference room, past the glass walls and the silent, staring faces, I felt the boundaries of my old life crumble a little more. For years, I'd accepted being invisible at home, dismissed as an afterthought at the dinner table. But now, in front of all these strangers, and my own family, I was impossible to ignore. The hallways outside the conference room hummed with activity, a steady current of engineers and managers carrying laptops, charts, and coffee cups. I walked in a kind of quiet daze, the clack of my boots echoing with more authority than I'd ever felt in my parents' home. The air itself seemed different, charged with the aftershocks of the meeting where the invisible daughter had just taken command of the very space her family believed she'd never belong in. A few younger employees nodded respectfully as I passed, one quietly asking if he could send me some follow-up questions. I smiled, told him yes, and made my way toward the executive lounge for a moment of calm before the next set of meetings. I sat alone by the window, watching the sun climb over the city's skyline and let myself breathe. I could still see the confusion in my father's face, the subtle shift from embarrassment to a dawning, reluctant pride that, well, I wasn't sure he'd let himself express. My phone buzzed with a message from my commanding officer, short, direct, and congratulatory. It was the kind of affirmation I'd hungered for all my life, but never dared expect from home. For a few minutes, I let myself feel it. As the break ended, I returned to the main office, greeted by the CEO, who asked if I would join her for lunch with a few other senior leaders. "You've made quite the impression," she said warmly, and I nodded, keeping my composure. The lunch was a whirlwind of ideas, project updates, and strategic talk, with the CEO and her team openly soliciting my thoughts about how to navigate the Army's evolving requirements. There was not a single moment in which I felt out of place. If anything, my confidence grew with every exchange. I found myself explaining technical nuances, discussing big-picture planning, and even mentoring a junior project manager on crisis response, all with the ease that came from years of earned expertise. At one point, as we wrapped up, the CEO caught my arm. "Colonel, your father's been one of our most dedicated people for decades. I never knew he had a daughter with your credentials. If you ever want to transition to the private sector, let me know. We'd be lucky to have you." For a moment, I saw my father standing at the edge of the room, overhearing the words. He stood awkwardly, hands clasped, caught between old instincts and new revelations. When lunch ended, he approached me, his voice unsteady. "Natalie, could you come to my office for a bit?" It wasn't a command, more of a request, hesitant and uncertain. I nodded, following him down the corridor. His office was a cramped corner lined with photos of Daniel, framed certificates, and models of projects he'd overseen. I took a seat opposite his desk. He struggled for a moment, gathering words. "I had no idea," he finally admitted. "I mean, I knew you were in the Army, but—" He shook his head, unable to meet my eyes. "I just didn't understand what you've become." There was a long silence. I studied the desk, the worn edges of his mouthpad, the carefully arranged pens, and waited for him to continue. "Your mother and we never wanted you to feel less than. It's just, we thought we knew what success looked like. Maybe we were wrong." He looked up then, raw vulnerability on his face. "You made your own way. I should have seen it sooner." For the first time, the walls between us felt thinner. "Dad, I never wanted you to be disappointed in me," I said quietly. "I just needed you to see that my choices weren't a rejection of you or the family. They were about what I knew I could give." He nodded, swallowing hard. It was easier to measure things by Daniel's milestones. But what you've done, what you're doing, none of us could have imagined. I am proud. Before I could answer, there was a knock on the door. Daniel poked his head in, awkward and uncharacteristically nervous. "Can I join?" he asked. My father gestured him in, and Daniel sat on the edge of the spare chair, elbows on knees. Got to admit, Nat, I had no idea either. I always thought the army was just, well, you know, marching and stuff. But seeing you today, you ran that room. Even Mom called me during lunch, freaking out. She said, "Our daughter is a colonel. Do you know what that means?" He laughed, shaking his head. You really showed them, all of us. Felt the first thaw of years-long frost, something gentle and uncertain blooming in the space between us. It took a while for me to realize, I said, but I never needed to outshine anyone. I just needed you all to see me as I am. Daniel nodded, a little more sincerely than I'd ever seen before. I do. I get it now. I'm sorry for all the times I joked or brushed you off. You've got guts. More than I ever will. There was an awkward pause, then he added, Mom's planning a big dinner tonight. I think she wants to make it up to you. That evening, back at the house, I found my mother in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her hands as she rolled out dough. The radio played softly in the background, and for once, she looked up at me and smiled without reservation. I hope you're hungry. I'm making everything you like. I laughed, feeling some of the old wounds loosen their grip. I'm starving, I admitted, and she laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You were always hungry after soccer practice. Some things don't change. We ate together as a family, this time with a different energy. Conversation was easier, lighter. My mother asked questions about my work, real questions, not the polite dismissive kind. Daniel teased me, but now with pride in his voice. My father listened more than he spoke, but when he did, it was to ask about my perspective or to share a memory from my childhood I'd nearly forgotten. There were moments when old habits threatened to creep in, but each time, someone gently nudged the conversation back, mindful now in a way they'd never been before. After dinner, my mother hugged me tightly, whispering, I'm sorry if we made you feel like you didn't belong. I just didn't know how to understand the life you chose. I squeezed her back, feeling years of longing ease just a little. I'm here now, I whispered. That's what matters. Later that night, lying awake in my room, I felt the peace of belonging, not because I'd finally proven myself, but because I'd been truly seen. For the first time, the house felt like a place I could rest. The burdens of comparison and invisibility had started to lift, replaced by something softer, something closer to love. And even as I drifted toward sleep, the world outside grew quiet, holding space for a future where I was no longer just the afterthought at the table, but an equal voice, a daughter, a sister, and myself, finally welcomed home. Months passed, each one quietly softening the hard edges of old patterns and grievances, as if the sharpest memories of hurt were slowly being sanded down by the gentle routines of reconnection. My visits home became less fraught and more familiar, even pleasant. No longer a parade of comparisons or tiptoeing through fields of old disappointments. My mother took to calling every Sunday, her voice warmer now, asking about my work with an interest that felt genuine. Sometimes she even bragged about me to her friends, proudly telling them her daughter was a colonel, that I ran the show at army meetings, that my advice was sought by generals. It was strange at first, to hear my achievements echoed from her lips, but there was a quiet joy in it too, a recognition I had always craved but never thought I'd receive. My father, ever the quiet type, changed in smaller, subtler ways. He'd send me newspaper articles about military technology, scrawling little notes in the margins. Does this remind you of your last project? Or, proud of you, Nat. On my birthday, he mailed a framed photo of me at the Pinnacle Conference standing at the head of the table in full uniform, flanked by executives and the CEO. On the back, he'd written, For my daughter, who taught me what leadership really means, and too found ways to reach out, sending the occasional text asking for career advice or updates on his own life, no longer filtered through the lens of competition but of genuine sibling curiosity. We met up for lunch whenever I was in town, and our conversations wandered from family to football to memories of childhood laughter replacing the old friction. The next family dinner was different from all the others that had come before. This time I arrived to the smell of roast chicken and fresh bread, the table already set with my favorite dishes. Ashley and Daniel arrived arm in arm, both more relaxed than I remembered, chatting about weekend plans. My mother greeted me at the door with a hug that lingered, pressing her cheek against mine. "It's so good to have you home," she said, her eyes shining. The house was filled with an ease that felt both new and somehow long overdue. We sat together, sharing stories and jokes, the conversation looping effortlessly from Daniel's latest work project to Ashley's gardening misadventures to my own travels. At one point, my father raised his glass. "To Natalie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for teaching all of us a little more about courage and about what it means to find your own path." There was a moment's silence, a collective breath held, and then the glasses clinked and the mood lightened again. The room sparkled with laughter, and for the first time I felt entirely present, no longer a shadow at the edge of my family's story, but part of its heart. After dinner, my mother and I washed the dishes together, hands moving in practiced choreography. "I never realized how much I missed having you here," she admitted, her voice quiet. "You've changed, Natalie. You're stronger, but also softer somehow." I smiled, feeling the truth of it. "I had to be strong for a long time," I replied, "but it feels good to be gentle now." She squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you. I'm sorry for all the years you felt alone at this table." The words landed softly, not as an accusation but as a balm, closing a wound that had never quite healed. Later that night, as I sat on the back porch, a cup of tea warming my hands, I let myself reflect on how far we'd all come. My family would never be perfect, but something real had shifted. They saw me now, not as an outlier or a disappointment, but as someone worth knowing and celebrating. The ache of being overlooked had faded, replaced by a sense of belonging so deep and steady it surprised me. Back at work, I carried this new piece with me. My leadership was different now, more open and empathetic. I found myself mentoring younger officers, encouraging them to speak their truth even if it went against expectations. I talked with soldiers who felt like outsiders in their own families and told them what I had learned, that sometimes the world outside your home will recognize your worth before the people closest to you do, but that healing is still possible. My colleagues noticed the change too. "You're lighter," one of my friends said over coffee. "Like you finally let go of something heavy." I nodded, understanding for the first time that the validation I'd craved from my family had always been secondary to the strength I'd found in myself. Months slipped into a year, and life moved on. My parents came to visit me in the city, walking the National Mall with the pride of tourists, but the familiarity of people who had learned to appreciate the world through my eyes. We ate at my favorite restaurant, shared stories, and made new memories. There were still moments of awkwardness, the occasional old habit surfacing, but we navigated them together, gently and with more understanding than ever before. On the anniversary of that pivotal dinner at Pinnacle, my mother sent me a message. "1 year since we learned who you really are, and I'm still learning every day. Thank you for not giving up on us." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the full weight of her words. The truth was, I hadn't given up, on them or on myself. I'd simply chosen, again and again, to keep showing up, to keep standing at my window that night, city lights glittering far below. I understood that my family's acceptance was not the end of my journey, but simply a part of it. I had made peace with my story, and in doing so, had given those I loved the chance to know me truly, deeply, finally. I no longer needed to prove myself, no longer feared being unseen. Instead, I welcomed each new day with gratitude, determined to live fully in the light of my own becoming, and to offer that light to anyone still searching for a place at their own family's table. And so, the seasons changed. Spring thawed the last of winter's bitterness, and my parents' house, once so heavy with old resentments, filled up with sun and easy laughter. My father started keeping the photo of me in uniform on his desk at work, not hidden in a drawer but right where anyone could see it. If a colleague asked, he'd tell the whole story. I'm the one who shaped national security, how the girl who never quite fit their expectations ended up being the person his own boss called ma'am. My mother delighted in any news article that mentioned my name, clipping them carefully, sending them to relatives, her pride now as quick and open as her disappointment had once been. She even began volunteering with a local veterans group, introducing herself as Natalie's mom, the title spoken with newfound warmth. Daniel, for all the sibling rivalry we'd survived, became my closest ally. He was the first to call whenever something big happened in my career, whether it was a promotion or a mention on national news. He stopped seeing me as competition, and instead asked for my perspective when he faced tough choices, about work, about marriage, about becoming a father himself. There was no trace of the old one-upmanship, only a brotherly respect that was deep and real. At family dinners, he'd joke about how he'd better watch out, or his kids would want to join the army just to be like their Aunt Natalie. And laughter would ripple through the table without a hint of old awkwardness. Even Ashley, his wife, shared with me one quiet evening that she'd once felt sorry for me, always on the road, missing holidays and celebrations. Now, she confessed, I hope our daughter grows up with your strength. You always stood your ground, even when no one else understood. It was the kind of validation I never expected, sweet and simple, healing the wounds I'd carried for so long. The family home itself changed too. My mother redecorated the guest room, once a shrine to Daniel's high school sports career, so that when I visited, it truly felt like mine. She set out fresh towels, a little vase of flowers, and on the bedside table a framed photo of me shaking hands with the CEO at Pinnacle, beaming in my uniform. There were other little touches, a mug with my Army insignia, a new flag hung outside on national holidays, books about military history stacked on the coffee table. My world, once kept outside the walls of this house, was now woven into its daily life. My parents asked about my work in ways that weren't perfunctory but real, questions about my projects, my team, what leadership in the Army meant on a personal level. My mother sent me care packages at my postings, always including a handwritten note about how proud she was, how grateful for the sacrifices I'd made. My father even traveled to a military conference where I was speaking, sitting quietly at the back, tears in his eyes as he listened to me command the room. Holidays took on new meaning. That Christmas, for the first time, my family insisted on visiting me rather than the other way around. We toured the city, saw the monuments, and I showed them the base where I worked. I watched as my father stood straighter, my mother beamed, and Daniel took photos of his children posing by the entrance sign, all of them genially delighted to share in this world I'd built for myself. In the evenings, we gathered in my apartment, cooking together, telling stories, and when I recounted the day Dad's boss had called me ma'am in front of the whole boardroom, the pride in my family's faces was radiant. My father would add, his voice trembling with affection, "That was the moment we understood, Nat. You didn't just find your own path, you made it so we could follow." Professionally, I found new confidence, a sense of ease that came not from proving myself to the world, but from finally being at peace within. I was promoted again, this time to oversee a division tasked with shaping policy and mentoring younger officers. I became the one others came to for advice, the one who advocated for soldiers who felt overlooked or out of place. When asked to speak at leadership forums, I shared not just the lessons of command, but the story of a family who had learned painfully, honestly, how to see one another again. It wasn't perfect, of course. Old habits sometimes resurfaced. There were days when my mother would fret over a deployment, when my father would unconsciously compare Daniel's business milestones to my own. But we could talk about it now. When I felt unseen, I could say so and be heard. When I felt alone, I knew I could call and they would answer. The greatest shift, perhaps, was internal. I let go of the desperate longing to belong, the need to twist myself into someone else's ideal. In its place grew a quiet acceptance, a knowledge that I was enough, that I was valued, both at home and in the world. The validation from my family was precious, but it no longer defined me. I had learned to stand alone, to carry my own light, and to invite others into it. Not on the anniversary of that first dinner back, the night they'd all dismissed me as nothing, and the day after, when Dad's boss changed everything. I hosted my family at my place, cooking the very meal my mother used to make. I set the table myself, making sure everyone's favorite dish was included. After we finished eating, I raised a glass. "To family," I said, my voice strong. "To the hard work of understanding each other, and to the love that keeps bringing us back together." My father's eyes shone, my mother squeezed my hand, and Daniel clinked his glass against mine. There was no need to say anything more. In that moment, everything unspoken was understood. I belonged, fully and finally, not because I'd become who they wanted, but because we had all learned to see and cherish one another as we truly were. And as the night wore on and laughter filled my home, I knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever promotions, deployments, or new beginnings might come, I would always carry with me the healing and hope of having found my place at the table. And so, as my story rounded a quiet bend, I found myself looking back not just at the pain and doubt that had shaped so much of my journey, but also at the transformations, some small and private, others sweeping and unmistakable, that had quietly remade my family and myself. Our relationships, once brittle and transactional, had matured into a kind of gentle partnership. We had learned to reach across our differences, to listen instead of assume, to give each other room to grow. Even in the smallest gestures, these changes showed. My mother calling to ask if I'd eaten after a long flight. My father forwarding articles about women in leadership. Daniel inviting me to join his family's summer barbecue. My nieces and nephews running up for hugs, proud to introduce me as the coolest aunt ever. I continued to rise in my career, now often traveling between cities, countries, and conference rooms, carrying both the weight and the wisdom of my experiences. Wherever I went, I was aware of how my presence had changed, how I entered new rooms with a different kind of certainty, unafraid of being underestimated. I had become not just a leader in uniform, but a mentor and an advocate, reaching out to soldiers and young women who struggled to find their place, just as I once had. I told them my story, never leaving out the nights I'd spent feeling invisible at my own family table, or the years I'd worked for recognition that never came. I taught them that real respect doesn't depend on applause, but on showing up for yourself, again and again, even when nobody is watching. With my parents, the honesty we'd earned became a foundation. We could talk about anything now, even the hard things, the loneliness of command, the stress of deployments, the cost of all those missed birthdays. My father sometimes told his own stories of falling short, of learning too late how to love his children as they were, not as he wished they'd be. My mother admitted that she'd been afraid for me and that her distance was sometimes just worry in disguise. But those confessions no longer hurt. They freed us, making space for gratitude and forgiveness. Daniel's family grew, and so did our bond. His children began to ask about my life, my travels, the medals on my shelf. I let them try on my old hat, told them stories of faraway places, encouraged them to believe they could become anything at all, even things their parents didn't yet understand. At one Thanksgiving dinner, as we all sat crammed around my apartment's dining table, Daniel lifted his glass and said, "I hope my kids are as brave as you someday." His wife smiled at me, her eyes warm, and the table erupted in laughter and cheers. In quiet moments, I sometimes wondered what might have happened if Dad's boss hadn't called me ma'am in that crowded boardroom. If the shock of that moment hadn't broken the old spell, would my family ever have seen me? Would I ever have stopped chasing their approval? But those questions faded in the face of what we'd built since. My family had learned to see me, yes, but I had also learned to see them, with all their flaws and fears, their pride and hope. I no longer needed to prove myself because I knew, deep down, that I was enough, and always had been. Even the house I once found stifling became a place of comfort. I visited often, welcomed not with wary politeness but with open arms and genuine excitement. My parents let me host family gatherings, letting go of the urge to control, simply happy to be together. Sometimes, when the night grew late and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of dishes in the sink, my mother would squeeze my hand and whisper, "I love you, Natalie. Thank you for coming home to us." Work became a place of joy and responsibility rather than proving ground. I thrived not just because I was skilled or accomplished, but because I led with empathy and vulnerability. I made space for the people around me to be themselves, just as I'd longed for growing up. My life was full, sometimes busy, sometimes overwhelming, but anchored now by the love I had helped repair. On the anniversary of that fateful family dinner, I walked through the city. The memory of that painful night softened now by time. My father called to say he and Mom were making apple pie just for me, and that they couldn't wait to see me again. Daniel texted a photo of his kids, waving tiny American flags and a note, "We're all rooting for you, Colonel." And I realized that, somewhere along the way, the need for recognition had quietly dissolved, replaced by a steady, sustaining. I was no longer a daughter seeking permission to belong, no longer a soldier desperate for acknowledgement. I was simply Natalie, strong, whole, at home in her own skin. The journey had taken years, had required courage, heartbreak, and perseverance. But in the end, I had become someone I could respect, someone who loved and was loved in return. And as I looked forward to the next chapter, I did so with the certainty that my seat at the family table was. And if you're listening this, if you've ever felt like the extra plate, the one left off the guest list, the name that never quite made it onto the family wall, know this: you are not nothing. You are becoming. Your voice is needed, and the story of your belonging is just beginning.